And we're live. Hey everyone, welcome back to another live stream. Keen to get into it. Keen to provide some essay feedback, hopefully help you with some questions that you might have. So feel free to ask your questions in the chat. And I can see that some random dude's been waiting, so appreciate your patience. Let me know if you've got any questions. Surely some of you have some assessment notifications, something you want to ask about that's happening in class. Now is your chance to ask your questions about things that are actually going to be relevant to your marks. Maybe you're struggling with something to do with an essay. Maybe it's a text. Maybe it's creative writing. A lot of people doing craft of writing right now. People are writing imaginatives, discursives. So ask away if you've got any questions that I can help with before I look at one of the student submissions that has come through this week. And if you are watching this and you're keen to get some of your work marked by me live so that you can get that immediate feedback, then make sure you use the link in the description for these live streams. So beneath every live stream video that gets published on YouTube, there's a link in the description. If you click there, you can submit your work. Just submit a paragraph or so with a question or prompt, and I will respond to that as soon as I can. So make sure you submit it sooner than later so you're earlier in the queue. But that is what we're going to be looking at a little bit later in this video. So Nala, great to see you. Some random dude, I just finished all my assessments. Wow, that's very soon. Just finished all of them. Where are you up to in the year? What unit of study are you doing? What's everyone up to at the moment? Give me some context if you can, and I should be able to help. But just taking some questions right now. So if you want to jump on, ask a question, throw out one of your assessment notification questions that you want some thoughts on, some advice on, I'm happy to help with all of that. So let's get into it now. Nala's got a question. How to write about a paragraph in an essay, not just language devices, e.g. vertigo. Right, how do you write an essay paragraph without just language devices? Well, the key thing to avoid having that more basic analysis is to focus on the form of the text. And when we say the form, I'm going to use that term very broadly, but basically the way to stand out in your body paragraphs with your analysis and devices is to talk about things like the structure of the text, right? So the actual structure, is it linear or non-linear if it's a prose fiction novel? And by the way, the fact that it's a prose fiction novel, if that's the case, that is the top layer of form. That's the whole form, right? It is a prose fiction novel. It's not a poem. It is not a film. It is not a play. If it's a play, why is it significant that it's a play? Why is it significant that it's using the dramatic form? What are the features of that? But if we're looking at prose fiction, narrative structure is really important. Is it linear or non-linear? Are there flashbacks? Why might that be important? Secondly, what's the style? Is there a specific style that the author tends to use? And you can look all of these things up, of course. You can do your research on it. I'm sure you'll talk about them in class. But it's important to actually create a dot point list of all of these key elements of form so that within each body paragraph, you're not just talking about metaphors and similes, but you're actually engaging with these more macro features that shape the text. So structure, well, let's first of all go through the text type. What is a text type? It's a prose fiction novel. A lot of people just say a novel. Definitely don't call it a book. Okay, it's a prose fiction novel. It might be a novella. If it's a short story, you can look up the technical categorization online and make sure you verify that with your teacher. But if it's a shorter text, it might be a novella, which is just a short novel. Still prose fiction. It's still written in that kind of everyday, loose, unstructured language versus like a poem. It doesn't sound like verse in a poem where the lines are very structured and organized. That's important to analyze. Then you look at the structure. Then you look at the voice, the narration style. A lot of people don't delve deep enough into the narration style when they're looking at their analysis in their body paragraphs. So they don't say, why is it important that the author has used a first-person narrative voice? Is it because they're trying to humanize the character? Are they trying to create a sense of empathy between the audience, the reader, and the character? Do they want us to relate to them more because they're presenting their point of view, they're focalizing their perspective? Or do they actually want to cast doubt on the narrator's perspective? Because the first person narration is unreliable. It's only coming from one person's point of view. It's sometimes trying to expose the subjectivity of truth, the subjectivity of perspective. that when you read an account of something, it's only from one person's perspective very often. So it's not that believable. It's unreliable. You can't think that everything they say is true. That also comes with first person. So you've got to think which of those elements or traits or kind of features or effects of that narration style are most relevant to your text. And that's another thing that you can explore as part of your analysis, and you can incorporate more specific techniques with those elements of form. So find a quote. If you wanted to talk about why first person narration is important, then find a quote that has the word I in it or my, so that you can not only talk about a specific technique that's in that sentence. So find a sentence that has a specific technique. Maybe it's repetition, maybe it's a metaphor, maybe it's a type of imagery, but ensure it has the word I or my, so that you can also talk about the broader effect of that first person voice. So you couple them together. Sometimes I use the kind of shortcut here, Biggie Smalls, right? Like the rapper, Notorious B.I.G. So old school rapper, Biggie Smalls, it's just a way to remember it. But big technique with small technique. So small technique is like a simile or a metaphor. Big technique is like the narration style, the nonlinear structure, the use of flashbacks, the use of soliloquies in a play. If you're talking about a film, you want to engage with the type of cinematography, the lighting, the mise en scene, right? Even in a novel, the characterization more generally, the style of the language more generally. Recurring techniques as well. Like say there are a lot of extended metaphors in a text, then try and engage more with those features versus the isolated techniques that only pop up every now and again. You really want to engage with those broader features. So hopefully that helps. Engage with those, make a list of say 5 things, and in each body paragraph, try and delve deep into it, at least one specific element of form, one of those macro features, one of the big techniques, and that can go with the small technique. And if you can, try and engage with 2. I personally would aim for 2 per body paragraph if I wanted to stand out. So I'm going to say something about the structure, and I'm also going to say something about the narrative voice, potentially in the same paragraph. I'm also going to talk about genre. Like what's the genre and how does that relate to the style of the language? So that now I've got another pairing, okay? And then you can keep going. And another one, you might talk about the fact that it's a prose fiction novel and that it's got that narrative structure to it. It's written in the telling mode. It engages us through that kind of story. So that might be important, right? And then you might find one other thing like characterization, or maybe there are lots of extended metaphors, or there's lots of sensory imagery throughout the whole text. Okay, well, that will be another thing. So try and find, I would say, 3 pairings that work well together. And so that allows you to, if you have 3 body paragraphs, you can engage with 2 elements of form, or at least macro features per paragraph. And that's a guaranteed way to stand out, so that you're not left just using repetition, simile, metaphor. Okay, easy hack if you can do that. If you want to go one step better than that, try and do the same thing with context and be linking things to the contextual influences that actually shapes the text. Like what inspired the author or composer to write the text the way they did? And that comes down to their authorial intent, like what was their specific intention as the author, but also what were the broader contextual elements that played into that representation? Why did the author actually represent the values that they did in the text? Yeah, in terms of context, when you say the era is the general term. That's right. So maybe it's like the postmodern era because it's written in that timeline, right? But you also want to engage with the specific elements or characteristics of the era. It's not enough to just say the postmodern era or the post-war era. You need to say the anxieties of the post-war era. You need to put a specific characteristic that was true of the time and that was influential to the construction of the text. That's how you use context. You refer to a specific influence by isolating one of the characteristics of the era, and then you say that in the sentence as well. So you don't say inspired by the post-war era. You say inspired by the anxieties or the psychological anxieties or the widespread anxieties of the post-war era. Okay, so you can kind of you can insert something in the blank there. Okay, so inspired by the insert specific characteristic of the post-war era. That's what the best responses do. They actually go that one step further to provide a more specific insight. So hopefully that helps. Any other questions about assessments right now? This is the best time to ask. I know that a lot of students are getting notifications. People have got assessments coming up in the next few weeks. Some students have it more towards the end of the term, but most of you should have some idea of the kind of assessment you're going to do. So in the comments, please do write in what kind of assessment you're doing this term. Are you doing a creative writing task? Do you have to write a reflection? Are you doing an essay this term? Let me know what you're doing so that I can throw out some thoughts, considerations that might help you with your preparation. And again, some random dude finished all your assessments. Give us some more context on that. Let me know where you're up to. What have you just finished? What are you moving on to? So now that you're doing the essay on vertigo, well, hopefully that advice does help. And remember, if you want to find things, I don't know if you're already on Jeddle, there's tons of information there on form, on context for you to incorporate with examples. But you can also do your own research, of course, to build up the list of features and know how to actually talk about them in a credible and accurate way. Obviously, you don't want to just make things up. So you need to make sure you've done your research, verified things. Amazing. Join up, email me if you have any questions about it. Otherwise, it should be pretty self-explanatory to get onto Jeddle. Hagseed and Tempest by Missy. Great. So big unit of study there. You're studying two texts together, Hagseed and Tempest being the most popular combination in that module for Module A. So my advice there is it's a tricky one. Try and keep the themes relatively simple in terms of how you structure your essay. So pick kind of two things. I like to focus on the imprisonment, the sense of imprisonment that's explored in both texts, and then the sense of freedom that is considered in both texts. And just with that simple framework, you can start getting into the nuances. But thematically, I would try and keep it relatively simple for your essay, for the framework of your essay. So just kind of exploring imprisonment in both, the types of imprisonment, who's imprisoned, why, and then do they become free? Why do they become free? What are the considerations there? Keep that pretty simple, because where you want to explore complexity is in the contextual comparison. Really go deep into the context of the Tempest. Understand all the nuances of the time that resulted in that particular representation of imprisonment. Why does it explore that type of imprisonment? Why was that type of imprisonment relevant to the values of the Jacobean era, right? So you need to actually create a linkage between the context and the representation, the particular example that you provide or what you're talking about. You need a link to context. I would be doing that basically every sentence. So Module A, I'm looking to do 3 contextual links per paragraph. If I'm doing 4 bodies with going Tempest, Hagseed, or text A, text B, text A, text B, I'm really going deep on context. I'm going to make sure that I'm saying specific things that most other people aren't going to mention because they're not going to be that detailed and specific. You don't need to go on too long about each element of context. You just need to show a very nuanced appreciation of the context, meaning don't just keep saying Jacobean era. You need to actually specify the values, the supernatural values, the patriarchal values, and link it to a relevant example, and then talk about how that results in a particular type of imprisonment that's explored. And then comes the comparison where you say, in light of the contextual shift, right, in Hagseed, because of Atwood's postmodern context, and then provide a specific value, a specific influence there, talk about how that representation and why that representation has been reimagined, okay? So that's where you get the points. Deep contextual knowledge and insight that's offered, right? The themes don't have to be that crazy, but deep contextual insight and really good links and differentiation between the texts. So there's where you find nuance as well. Like when you compare the text and show how the characters have morphed and changed and then link that to context, that's what's going to impress the marker. But of course, conceptually, you want to stand out and you want to try and say things in a sophisticated way. But my starting point would actually be going quite simple with the framework. Focus on the context, focus on unique comparisons between the texts and points of difference, and then attributing the differences to context. And then you can try and kind of reframe your themes and concepts in a slightly more sophisticated way. Okay, so at our school, everyone has to write a response for English Advanced. I think for at one, our school has to write a response for English Advanced. Not sure quite what that is. Give me a bit more on that. Maybe I'm just misreading that. So apologies, yeah, Striker, if that's the case, but give me a bit more context on what you mean there. The structure. So Elijah, thanks for the question. When you say the structure, could you guys, make sure you guys give a little bit of context on the questions? Do you mean how do you structure an essay? You want help with the structure of an essay or the structure of something else? So give me a little bit more detail if you're still on here, Elijah, just so I can answer exactly what you need or what you're asking. Perfect. How to structure an essay. Thought so, but just wanted to make sure I was going to answer your question. So how do you structure an essay? I mean, it's quite a broad thing. I'll just go through it simply. I would be, unless you're doing 2 texts in the one essay, I would be doing 3 body paragraphs. So an introductory paragraph, 3 body paragraphs, and a short conclusion. Conclusion only needs to be 2 sentences. Introduction is incredibly important. Should be around 4 sentences, 4 to 5. 3 sentences is often just too short. So I find 4 is the sweet spot, 5 if you need. Okay, so in terms of your body paragraphs, you should have 3 key ideas. They're going to be also introduced and mentioned in the introduction in slightly different terms, along with context, form, overall plot, links to the question, and your thesis statement. That's what's going to be in the intro. But in your body paragraph, each one should have a specific conceptual focus. I would focus the first body paragraph on the initial problem that is set out in the text. Okay, so what's the main problem or tension explored in the beginning of the text or at the beginning? So first third of the text. Then move on to what's the consequence of that problem? What is the struggle of the individual because of that problem that you talked about in the first body? That's what you talk about in the second body. So problem, consequence, or response to that problem. Consequence of that problem or response to that problem is the second body. And these could be different themes. This is the framework that you can insert any theme into. And then the last paragraph, where you move towards the end of the text that you're studying, your third body paragraph should be about whether there's a resolution. Like, is there a solution to the problem that the author set out at the beginning? Because there was a complication that needs to be resolved. How is that complication resolved? What's the lesson learned about how to fix that problem that you've just explored? So you get to the third body, and now you're talking about more the end of the story, the end of the text, and you're providing suggestions as to how to resolve that problem based on what was represented at the end of the text, if there is a solution. So that's how I think about 3 body paragraph structure. That is the main structure that I would use for any essay. Now, do I change that from time to time based on the text or the module? Sure. But more or less, I'm always using that because I find that that is the most logical structure to move through a text. Texts naturally have that progression. They introduce a problem. There's a complication. We learned this early on, in primary school. There's a complication. Okay, now there's a series of events in response to that. There are all of these further complications because of that big problem, that tension. And then you get to kind of a climax and there's a resolution and we learn something. There's a learning that comes from this process. There's often a journey that the character has to undertake. And then there are some insights that come at the end and there's some kind of resolution. Sometimes there's not, and then there's a message behind that. But I would move through your essay just like how the story moves through it, but you're telling a story of ideas. You're telling a story of ideas in your essay, so it's analytical, whereas in the original text, they're telling a story, right? A story that has a plot. Okay, so you don't want to plot tell, you don't want to story tell. You want to tell a story of ideas. It's all concepts, and then you back it up with analysis. Okay, what critical readings do you recommend for Mod A? Do you know any off the top of your head about intertextuality and context? I do know critical readings, more so for specific text though. So let's see if you followed that up. It would be good to have some specific text that you can bring up. I mean, in terms of specific critics and critical perspectives on certain topics, yeah, I'm going to need some specifics there, and I can get back to you. Maybe it's something you can email me. I'm happy to try and help there. So you're doing King Richard III and looking for Richard. I definitely have some good papers. We do a lot of this research when we compile the Jeddle resources. We try and package that all into a digestible format for you online. But what I can do, if you email me, Jonny, Jonny, at jeddle.com, I can try and send you across some, well, I will send you across some critical readings that I have found quite useful, specifically for King Richard III and looking for Richard. So yeah, none off the top of my head for those specific texts, but I know I have some in the bank that we would have used to inform the resources, and generally that I found helpful to understand those texts. How many quotes evidence should we aim to have for an analytical essay or per body paragraph? Oh, by the way, sorry guys. So just to go back here for a second, critical readings, look up Google Scholar, JSTOR. You should all have access to JSTOR either through like a library membership that you can all get for free. So make sure you sign up to that, and then you can get on the JSTOR. Your school might have a membership on the JSTOR. But JSTOR is a library of academic articles that will have great references that you can include in your responses and just give you really good ideas. Google Scholar, go to Google Scholar now, type in your text name, type in, King Richard III looking for Richard into textuality. See what comes up. There have probably been a lot of papers written on that topic, and if you just scan them and look for some different ideas, you're going to learn a lot, and you'll get some great vocabulary that's going to help you stand out, and some fantastic ideas to explore. Okay, so look at those things. And again, Jeddle has a critics section on most of them, and will already have the key parts from each critical reading. So coming back to this, how many quotes evidence should we aim to have for an analytical essay or per body paragraph? In a single body paragraph, how many quotes should you have? Well, let's zoom out. In a single essay, how many quotes should you have? The rule of thumb is that you should have 12 core quotes. And I'm saying core quotes or primary quotes. 12 primary quotes per essay. So if you do 3 body paragraphs, then you divide 12 by 3, you get 4 quotes per paragraph. So that's the rule of thumb. 4 quotes, primary quotes per body paragraph. Now, why am I calling them? First caveat, if you're a slower writer, you might only be able to do 3. Okay, so this all depends on your speed of writing, because when you're writing an essay under exam conditions, what's more important than getting the 12 quotes in is having a complete essay. So if you have to forfeit a couple of those quotes in order to have a completed essay, then do that. So make sure you do the preparation in advance to figure out how many words you can actually write under timed conditions while also adapting to the question. And then you've got to cut your draft essays down to that point. Okay, so that's going to free up room to actually complete the essay and make sure it's adapted to a question. But 12 would be the kind of rule of thumb goal. Some people have enough speed to get more in, but 12 is sufficient. 12 is enough to get full marks. That's what you really want to know, right? 12 is enough to get full marks. Even a little bit less is enough to get full marks if you do it well. I'll tell you what the other caveat to this is, right? The other nuance. 12 primary quotes, but what the best students do is they weave in other quotes, not long quotes, short quotes, like 1-word quotes, 2-word quotes. They weave them in to their analysis of primary quotes, maybe longer quotes. Shorter quotes are better generally anyway, so avoid having really long quotes that take up more than a line. Try to get only the essential words of the quote in there and focus more on your analysis. So you want most of the words of the sentence to be your words of analysis versus the words of the quote that you're analyzing. So shorten the quote as much as possible. Make sure it's got a technique. Make sure you can potentially link it to something about the form or the style. Okay, great. We've ticked the box in terms of choosing the right evidence, and hopefully it supports the body paragraph concept that you're exploring. And then what the best students will do is in their analysis, when they're talking about the ideas, they'll weave in a couple of other little quotes, convenient quotes that just merge in nicely and almost replace their own words. They're not quotes that have techniques. They're just quotes that work well in lieu of your own words. Okay, so you replace what you would have said with words from the quote that are essentially the same, and that shows a deeper textual engagement. So that's a pro tip for you all. Once you get your 12 or so quotes, that you're going to have a technique for in each sentence. When you write your analysis, go back through the text and see if you can find nice phrases or words from the text that can actually replace some of your analysis. So you weave it in. And it's that seamless integration of quotes that's going to allow you to elevate your sophistication. And that is what the best students do. Some of them do it multiple times per sentence. So they'll have a core quote, and then they'll have 3 other sections in the same sentence where there's 1 or 2 word quotes that have been embedded within the sentence. Okay, so that is a skill, but it's actually a really easy one to adopt once you're aware of it. So just try to do it, look for the right words to replace your own words, and suddenly the sophistication's gone up because you're engaging more with the text itself, but it's still your analysis. Okay. Now, let's come back to, let's see what else we've got here. Rafin, can I make a good short story with descriptive inner monologues, thoughts, and vivid setting and techniques rather than action or dialogue? Absolutely, you can. So when you're doing a short imaginative piece, there doesn't need to be a lot of action. And in fact, having too many things happen in an imaginative is one of the biggest mistakes students make. So here's the first point on this. Choose a moment in time that is very short for your imaginative pieces, okay? So try not to think about short stories, but an imaginative piece that explores one critical moment in time. I always like to think of the imaginative pieces when you're at school as a page, one page out of a really long novel. And it's the most intense page. It's where something profound happens. It's where the character is challenged. So it's a page or 2 out of a novel is what you're basically capturing. So you don't need to have that much stuff happening. Does something need to happen? Yes, because you need to be able to distinguish an imaginative from a discursive or a persuasive piece. And to do that, it's important to have some plot element, some characterization, and a setting. So if you have a setting and you have a character, as long as they're doing something or they're in the middle of something, maybe they're contemplating something, which I think you're getting at here, and they're in deep thought, right? They're in deep thought, so it's like a monologue. Yes, that works, but I would try to have something that suggests they are in a world that you've created, like there's something actually happening. It might only be a couple of small actions that they take, like maybe they're reading through a diary, or they're looking at something, and it's provoking reflection. So it's great to have a lot of deep reflection. It's great to have vivid descriptions of the setting that reflect the character's internal state, but it's also important to have a couple of things, little things, bits of action, critical pieces of action that actually happen. Okay. Dialogue's always risky. I would only use dialogue. I would only use a lot of dialogue if that is something you're really trying to use based on a prescribed text or a mentor text that you've looked at. So unless dialogue is a critical thing, a critical stylistic element that you're trying to use because of a text that you've studied, then I would avoid using a lot of dialogue. Okay, that's just a general rule. Why do I say that? Because dialogue is very hard to execute in an authentic way, right? It's very hard to pull off, and you only have a short amount of time to show off your imaginative writing skills. So I would spend more of that time on description and vivid description, right? Detailed description of the setting and the sensory experience of your character or characters. Try and keep it really just to one character if you can, because you don't have that much time. So one character, one setting. Yes, you might have a flashback, might mix up the structure a little bit, might have a flashback in the sense of the character thinking back to something, and then you have another setting and maybe another character involved. Fine. That can be really effective as well, because you are showing that you know how to create a non-linear structure in your piece. But that aside, I would keep it very simple in terms of the setting, what happens, and how many characters you have. One character, one main setting. Something has to happen. Something critical has to be happening. Now, the only thing I would say to try and avoid is falling into the trap of just having that monologue the whole way through and not having any sense of world built in, where there's an actual world in existence in some way. It can be completely made up, of course, but I think that is important to have those conventions of an imaginative piece in there to demonstrate that. Otherwise, a monologue can very much sound exactly the same as a discursive piece. And you might think that's great because it's going to adapt so well to the discursive if I have to do a discursive piece. That's true, but you're going to be in trouble if it's a much more kind of pragmatic piece that has to be an imaginative one, and there's a real life set in and prompt that you're forced to engage with in some way, you might fall into a little bit of trouble there. But a little bit of action is okay, but make sure there's something to happen in, and make sure it's a really important thing that is happening, even if it's just something that provokes the thought that drives the monologue that goes for majority of the piece. But yeah, dialogue not as important. If there's a couple of bits of dialogue that are meaningful, great. Maybe you're remembering something someone said. Maybe someone says something and it triggers a thought. But otherwise, you don't need to have too much happening. So hopefully that answers your question. People who do have a lot of action, that's also that can also be great. Just make sure it's within a confined time period, and it's accompanied by lots of description, and it's not just you jumping from one thing to the next to the next. This happens, then this happens, then this happens, then I went there, then I went there. There's no sense of authenticity. No one's going to be able to relate to that. No one's going to be able to visualize your piece and what's actually happening, because you haven't created that world for us to enter. Keep that in mind. When you're doing an imaginative, you're creating a world for the reader to enter. And if you just have actions happening without description, without capturing the mood, without capturing the setting, then we can't enter that world. We don't believe that world. So that is a really critical piece. What would be your response to an essay question about how Atwood's reimagining of Tempest reveals the values of each author? Yeah, well, where I would start there is through the main framework of Module A, especially for Tempest Hagseed here. So the main framework is that Margaret Atwood's Hagseed preserves some elements of the Tempest, but it reinvents others. So she reimagines a lot of it, but she also preserves certain elements. Now, she's kind of commemorating Shakespeare, because the whole point is it's part of this Hogarth Shakespeare project, and she's trying to pay tribute, pay homage to Shakespeare, 400-year birthday, etc. They're trying to create an adaptation that is celebrating Shakespeare, but at the same time, it's a postmodern text, and Atwood wants to adapt the story to the times, so she reimagines it based on the values of her postmodern contemporary context. Okay, so she's paying tribute and preserving a lot of things. There are some values that carry through, but a lot of the values are transformed so as to resonate with the contemporary audience. So you start with a basic proposition like that she is preserving a lot of the piece, but she's reimagining it to reflect contemporary values. And then you get a little bit more specific than what I'm saying here in terms of what those values are. So that's kind of the top line. In terms of how she does reimagine, how the reimagining reveals it, by reimagining a story, think about it like this: by adapting the story of Shakespeare in The Tempest, by adapting The Tempest to Hagseed, how does that reveal certain values? Well, it actually exposes certain differences, or rather, the differences in the reimagining expose the different contextual values of each text. So we get a deeper understanding of each composer's context by exploring the dissonances between the original text and its reimagined, modernized adaptation. Okay, so that was the critical point. By looking at two things that are, by looking at one thing that's based on another thing, by looking at Atwood's text, which is based on Shakespeare, because there are certain differences in the reimagining, even though it's an adaptation, because there are certain differences, you're able to learn about the context of each one, because those gaps can be attributed to the contextual dissonances between the texts. So I hope I'm making sense here. But again, if you look at two things and they're basically meant to have the same story, but they're told in a different way, you can say, well, this one was made 400 years ago because it had the Jacobean influence, and it had supernatural, and it had the patriarchal values, and it had all of these kind of medieval values coming through as well, about revenge being important. And then we go to the postmodern context where it's a similar storyline, but suddenly everything's more psychological. It's more psychoanalytical. It's more about, the inner psyche, the inner psychological experience of individuals. It's more about projecting a feminist lens, more progressive lens. So similar story, but the certain adaptations are very telling of those contextual shifts, of the progression of the values through time. So then you get into your framework of the structure itself. So if we look at the body paragraphs, I would still be keeping that imprisonment, first half, freedom, second half structure. Then when you explore the elements of imprisonment, who's imprisoned and why, you can attribute each thing, each aspect of the imprisonment to a contextual value. And then you compare it, right? You compare it to the reimagined version in Hagseed. So for anyone doing a comparative study, you just look at the first text, then go to the second text, and then you're going to be able to say, well, because this representation of imprisonment was different, this teaches us about the progressive values of Atwood's time, right? That shape the context. So again, different representations expose contextual dissonances. So that's how the reimagining reveals the values of the author, because you're able to explore those values. You're able to see those values in an amplified form. The values of each text are amplified through the reimagination of the text, because now you have something to contrast between, right? You have two things to contrast and compare. Hopefully that makes sense. High level stuff. We could get into more specifics, but there's a fair bit there to work with for thesis, introduction, and then general structure. Keep to that imprisonment freedom if you like that structure, and just keep talking to the contextual values that influenced each representation. And then you can make those comparisons, and you do a great job if you're able to do that with enough specificity and attention to detail with the context. Okay, we've dealt with that one. Nala, back to you. Our essay question is, when the environment changes, so do our experiences. So if you just wanted a little bit of commentary on that. When the environment changes, so do our experiences. I mean, key words that you need to explore there: environment, right? And change, like obviously environment changes, so do our experiences. So you're looking for a relationship between someone's environment and their experiences. You need to make sure you really unpack what the relevant environment is. Okay, so look for adjectives that go before the environment. Are we talking about a physical environment, a geographical environment? I'm sure that's true of the story at times, right? But then are we thinking about any other types of environments, like a familial environment? Are we talking about one's psychological environment? Okay, so try and think as broadly as possible about that word environment, because environment isn't just physical. And a change in a physical environment has implications on one's psyche, on one's emotional state. So that's the linkage with experiences, right? The lens through which you see the world, the way you experience the world, is very much shaped by the environment that you exist within. And when an environment becomes tainted by a particular adversity, I think that's what you can tap into there, right? Like if there's a hardship or an adversity or loss that occurs within one's environment, if you lose someone, if there's a death, then your environment has changed. Your environment has darkened. So you've got to use that kind of language. And when that happens, the lens through which you view the world, your experience of the world, is similarly affected. You start to see the world through that lens of that death or that loss. But if we move forward through the text, you also build a sense of resilience. When your environment changes, that can create a sense of resilience, which means that your experience over time becomes more resilient. Okay, so you link that kind of environmental change to having that challenge. Explore that at the start of your essay, that there's a suffering, there's a challenge. You start to view things through that lens. You start to disconnect from others. You have more disconnected interpersonal relationships and experiences in light of an environmental change that implicates a loss or a death. Now we're flowing. And then we get to the second half of the essay, right? Or you move through, again, 3 body paragraphs, but you move through and you ultimately get to a point where you're saying, notwithstanding adverse changes or challenging kind of changes or shifts in one's environment, both physically and psychologically or within one's family, those environmental changes can actually inspire experiences of resilience. They can build character. They can transform one's worldview, and then you can get into detail on that. So kind of like a negative, positive attitude or approach I would take there in terms of the structure. But tap into those specifics on what types of environments are you talking about, what were the changes, and answer those questions in relation to the beginning of the novel, the middle, and the end. The beginning, the middle, the end, and that will help shape your first body paragraph, second, and third. How do you make T tables? Is it just based on themes? It's a good question, Phoenix. How do you make T tables? Like technique, right? Technique being like a metaphor, evidence being the quote. I assume you're using it as, right? Evidence, like give me the quote that has the technique in it. Or maybe you're actually saying it as topic sentence if you're talking about teal. I'm not sure if you mean T in the topic sentence way or technique sense, because people use the acronyms very differently these days. But if you have T as the topic sentence and then E as the evidence, which includes a technique and a quote, and then the other E as the explanation or effect, then that's a slightly different approach. What I'll suggest, I'll take it that the T you're talking about is like a topic sentence. Oh, it is. Sorry, here we go. Clarification. Appreciate it. It is technique, example, effect. Okay. So how do you make tables for technique, example, effects? To be honest, when I go through a text, if I'm going through it either myself or with a student, I first of all, and this is just how I do it, so I'm just going to tell you candidly, I'm not going to tell you something that I don't tend to do. I find it most helpful to actually go through the text in chronological order, and pick out in order the most significant quotes that I find within each part. So let's say you're looking at a play and there are 5 acts. I'll separate. I'll make a document like a Google Doc, and I will have Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, Act 5. I'll have a table within each, and each table will have about 5 or 6 rows. Okay, and there'll be 3 columns if I'm doing the T table. So technique, example, effect. And to be honest, I would actually do the quote on the left. So I do the example first. It'd be like an ETE or an ETA, some people call it, like example or evidence, technique, and analysis. Analysis, effect are the same thing here. So don't worry about the specifics. But 3 columns, I would put all of the quotes from each part or each chapter. Again, if there's like 30 chapters, you can group the chapters together. So you've got about 4 or 5 sections overall. And I'm chronologically going through, picking out the key quotes in order, making sure I've even got like the page number or whatever is relevant for your text. Then I'm getting the technique or multiple techniques that might be in that extract. And then I'm doing a short effect to say, okay, this suggests, the disempowerment of Rupert, making up things here. But you're putting in a little effect that would help with your analysis. And once you do those tables in roughly chronological order, what you then can do after is consider the 3 key themes that you want to explore in your essay. Okay, then you think about the 3 key themes. And by themes, again, I mean, what was the core problem or tension? And that might be that, the government was oppressing society by or the government was suppressing free speech. Okay, so there's like a problem going on. No one can think freely. Okay, no freedom of speech is the problem. Then what's the response? Then individuals try to band together to rebel. Okay, that's the second one. And then the third thing is the rebellion is futile if or unless everyone works together, or when people start thinking just working for themselves, then the rebellion doesn't work. So you have like 3 ideas like that: body 1, body 2, body 3. Once you've considered that based on your understanding of the text, you go back to the T tables where you've collected all of those extracts with the techniques and the short effects, and you start grouping them. You've got 3 themes. You've got your chronologically ordered T tables split into those 4 or 5 different sections. And then you start going through each quote, and I go through them in order, and I go, which ones fit into that theme? Which ones fit into that theme? Because it's not just going to be that, the first 3 quotes you have are the 3 that you have to use in your first body paragraph theme. So sometimes you might want to have 2 quotes from your first section, your first T table, and then you go down to the second part 2, and you find 1 or 2 quotes there, and then you want to kind of work with those in that body paragraph. So I'm hoping that makes sense. You start chronologically documenting everything, or otherwise you can just do the theme thing first, but I don't do that. I go through it in order so that I make sure I understand everything in context. I know what came first and second. I often find students are using quotes out of order, and they're using things incorrectly for that reason because they're thinking something happened before it did. So always good to know the order of things. And then once you get your 3 concepts together, you make 3 topic sentences, then you go to your table, and great, you've already got all of the possible evidence, and you just hand pick the best ofs. I just do a best of selection, and I make sure I'm selecting pieces from the T table that aren't repetitive. I want to get new insights. I want to pick out evidence that proves something else. Yes, they all support that same theme, so they're all going to go in the same paragraph, but I want to make sure I'm exploring different perspectives, or I'm advancing the argument. So what you end up selecting and how you order the evidence that you pick from the T tables is super important. So make sure you're not repeating the same points. I'm not sure if that completely answered your question about how to actually build them, but I literally just go through a text, look for key quotes, document them in order. I only choose the most important ones. Maybe I've chosen too many after I get to the end of the chapter, and I just get rid of the ones that I don't think are as meaningful. And then you end up grouping the most relevant ones into your themes. And that's essentially how you'll get to a really good place where everything will make sense. You'll have a nice logical progression in your argument, and you're doing what most students are not going to be bothered to do, but it's going to make a huge difference for the cohesion, for your essay really moving along nicely, because you've considered the order of everything and you haven't used anything out of context. So I hope that helps, Phoenix, but let me know if you've got any follow-ups on that. Let's see here. You did have a follow-up before. How do you deal with overthinking or being a perfectionist? It paralyzes me from getting work done efficiently. Well, I can tell you, Phoenix, I definitely relate to you there. I spent way too much time at school and at uni fussing over things that just weren't going to matter. And that's why I had to force myself. There's 2 things here that I had to learn, right? And that I kind of did, but I wasn't that good at it. Even now, I'm always working on it. I'm still not great at it. I think if you're a perfectionist by nature, you'll never really get rid of that, but you can learn to develop strategies that help mitigate it, so you're not wasting time and obsessing over little things that don't matter. But the first thing is, write down the key priorities in terms of what is going to pay off the most in terms of your time allocation. Right? So this is the 80-20 rule. I just put a video up recently. Go and look at the recent YouTube videos. Something like, how to study less and get better marks, or, how to study properly, or something like that. But it's one of the recent videos, and it's all about how you can actually you can write down and make a list of what are the key things you can be doing that are going to give you essentially 80% of the benefit. And they're often the things we tend to avoid because they're a little bit harder to do, like doing a past paper. Well, I just want to make notes because it's kind of soothing and I feel like I'm doing something. Well, you feel like you're doing something, but that's not going to give you the final results that you want because you're not putting yourself in the mindset of an exam. You're not actually getting in there and feeling like what it is to do an exam. That's an example for the same maths. With English, you need to not be obsessing too much over the wrong things. Now, there's no wrong thing as such. I think there's a benefit of perfectionism, to be honest. You just have to allow more time. But if you are not considering kind of the most important elements of the response, say, and you're just focusing on like one particular part of a sentence and how that sounds versus making sure you have really high level concepts, really good themes, and you've done the research to get those concepts and to stand out, then you're kind of obsessing over the wrong thing there. I think it's fine to be a perfectionist in the sense that you want to make everything perfect, but make sure that you are having a priority list. So write down a list of the things when you build the essay that you think is going to be most important. What's going to pay off the most for you in terms of what you're doing? And if you're even spending time for English on something other than building your essay drafts, and it's just kind of like note taking, then that's inefficient. You need to actually think about what are the things that are going to translate to results for my assessments at the end of the day, right? Otherwise, that will paralyze you and you won't get things done efficiently. This is kind of a not the best answer, I think, but it's a little bit long-winded, so I apologize. I also want to make the point that the perfectionism can be good. I think it is actually good. I obsessed over things, And I think if you don't obsess over things, you don't get that perfectly refined sentence at the end of the day, which is going to have an impact on the impression on the marker. So if you're really going for perfect marks, of course you need to be a perfectionist about it because you're trying to be perfect. So I was a perfectionist all throughout school with essays, with everything I did, especially with English. Like I would obsess over little sentences. Is this the best word? But you've got to allow enough time for that, and make sure that you're not doing the things that are going to take hours to do just to like achieve a little bit, when you could be doing far more effective things for other subjects or for that subject. Which brings me to the last point. I think this is probably the most useful thing I can tell you on it. What I used to do is I used to frame my day. This is the thing you're probably looking for. I used to structure my day, and I still do. I do this way more now, right? Because I've learned this. I structure my day so that the things that I'm going to waste time on, being a perfectionist on, I leave that until the end of the day. I leave the perfectionist things that kind of paralyze me until the end of the day, until the end of the evening. And I knock out the things that are far more practical and that are going to have much more of an impact on my marks overall, including for other subjects. So if we look at it on the subject level, when I did my HSC preparation, okay, I never did English at the start of the day because I would definitely experience what you're talking about here. And I would be a perfectionist and I'd end up spending an hour just trying to get one sentence right or trying to cut down a few words. And I'm like, I'm using up all of my best hours of the day, because you have best hours, right? Typically it's, an hour or two after you wake up. That's when your cognition is strongest. And then when you're about to go to bed, you're tired, your brain's tired. So you've got to utilize your brain in the best way. And that meant that I was always doing maths past papers and past papers on other subjects at the start of the day when I was freshest. And I was putting myself into that exam scenario and really giving myself that 80-20 exercise straight away. When I'd always leave English to the end of the day, and it was almost like a treat, right? I know that sounds weird, but it was like a treat at the end of the day because I knew I was just going to sit there for 2-3 hours, and you've got to allow time to burn here, 2-3 hours, and not really achieve much. But I was thinking about it. I was trying to perfect each sentence, but at least I'd got the important stuff done earlier that day. And I had that time to waste, which, by the way, because that compounds, you do the 2 to 3 hours. This is before the HSC. Of course, you don't always have 2 to 3 hours to waste, but 2 to 3 hours after, 6 hours on something else, you feel accomplished with everything else. And you're just like, hey, I've got time now to just really get every little bit right here. And that's going to put you in a position to get a 20 instead of an 18. Now, you could get an 18 doing a lot less work, but those 2 to 3 hours of wasted time, of paralysis, when you're obsessing over little things, because you've shifted it to the end of the day and it hasn't compromised all your other important work, because you prioritize that because you knew that, you could do a past paper. It's more objective. It's more clear cut. There's not really as much risk for the perfectionist trap. Because you did that, those 2 to 3 hours compound over time, and they'll give you the extra mark or two per essay, for instance, if we're putting it in really practical terms. Now, that's not a big payoff for the amount of time you did, but that's how the 80-20 rule works. As you try to get the last couple of marks for each of your responses, you have to put in a disproportionate amount of time. It's not the most efficient allocation of time, but it's the way that you get to a perfect result. So in summary, I'm glad you got me to reflect on this. And sorry, I didn't have like a polished answer up front, but I think we got there, and I'm glad you got me thinking about it. Key insight is whatever you feel most paralyzed by, or whatever you feel like you get trapped by perfectionism the most by, right? So, perfecting this sentence of my essay. Like I really want to just keep reading over my English essays. You push that to the end of the day and prioritize the things that are going to have much more of an impact on your marks. Okay. So the less difference that a study exercise or an activity is going to have, for instance, rereading the same sentence 100 times to try and get it perfect, the less impact that's going to have on your mark, even though it will have some impact, maybe by a mark or two over time, that gets pushed to the end of the day when you can afford to waste a couple of hours over something else. But make sure that you don't do that at the start of the day or the start of your afternoon if you're coming home from school, because that will, you will obsess over it and you won't have got anything else done. I guarantee you. And this is literally the challenge of most people's lives every day. It's like getting the priorities right, doing the right things first. And the right things are not the things that you're going to obsess over inside and out more often than not. Sometimes they will be because there'll be a reason that it's that important. But generally throughout year 12, I always started with the more pragmatic things where I could just do maths questions or, do practice questions for economics in my case, right? Or if you're doing science, you do that. It's things that are actually building you up, preparing you in the most efficient way for your exams and assessments. And then the things you're going to waste time on because you can't help but obsess over, you push them to the end. So you still do them, but it didn't compromise everything else. So I know I've repeated that a couple of times. I just want to hammer that in because I think we got there. We got the clarity on it. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me know what you think about that, Phoenix. But that's my take. And hopefully that makes sense to everyone else. If you find you're kind of wasting a lot of time on a particular thing because you can't help but continue reading over sentences after sentences, then you need to push that thing to the end of your study program for that day or study routine or end of the week or something, right? You could think about it in days or weeks, but it gets pushed to the back of the queue unless it's a fundamental thing. Like, hey, I need to write a draft essay. Okay, that's not back of the queue, that's front of the queue. Hey, I need to perfect this essay. I've got a draft, it's pretty good, but I want to make it better. That's back of the queue now because you've already done 80% of the work to get there. But now, if you want to get the extra 4 or 5 marks, you're going to have to spend a lot of time not achieving a lot. Okay. And that's what it takes to get the top marks. But push it further back in your study routine or your study plan for that day or week accordingly. Great question. I don't know if anyone's asked that before in these live streams. We get a lot of similar questions, but question of the day, Phoenix. So thanks for prompting me on that. How would you prepare for an unseen Mod A question on Keats and Campion? Okay. How would you prepare for an unseen Mod A question on Keats and Campion? Well, let's think about that broadly speaking. I'll give you the basic steps. Step 1, write a draft essay on Keats and Campion to a practice question that you either get from your teacher or from a past paper. That's step 1, write a draft. Step 2, time that draft out. Look at that little emoji's coming on now. Time that draft out in timed conditions and figure out if you can write that in 80% of the allocated exam time. Because if you're getting an unseen question, that means you're getting 40 minutes or 45 minutes to write it. Because you need time to adapt to the question, you need to time your draft and cut it down so that when you write it out, just looking at it, you can print it out and just look at it and write it out before you memorize anything. You need to make sure that you can write that draft version in 32 minutes or 34 minutes if you get 40 minutes, because you need to already allow for that buffer time to think about a question and make changes throughout your exam time, right? Make changes to the draft. So this is the whole thing about English being a more of a preparation-based subject, because you get ready for the exam in advance. All the hard work's done in advance. On the day, you're just executing. You should have already done all the hard work. So step 1 is make a draft. Step 2 is time the draft and cut it down. Understand your word count that matches up with the desired time limit. So if you get 40 minutes, how many words can I write in 32 to 34 minutes? And I'm giving myself that nice 6 to 8 minute buffer to adapt on the day to the question and think about the question so that I have time to actually write a full essay. If you have a draft essay that takes you 40 minutes to write and you get 40 minutes on the day with an unseen question, that is no good, because you have allocated 0 seconds to thinking about the question. You're only incentivized to just regurgitate your pre-prepared essay. You're not setting yourself up for success. So prepare a draft early. I should have added that in. Early as possible. Prepare a draft as early as possible. Multiple weeks in advance of your assessment. Get that out of the way straight away. That's an 80-20 exercise. Time the essay and cut it down. Okay, time yourself, cut it down so you've got that window to adapt. That's step 2. These are both 80-20 exercises that will lead to a material difference in your marks. Step three is refine the essay, get feedback on the essay, perfect the essay. And that's where we're getting into, okay, this is how I'm going to get the extra 3 to 4 marks at the end. But I've done the bulk of the work by doing the draft and timing it and reading over it myself. Now you need to go get feedback. Now you need to read it aloud over and over. How can I say that better? Go and ask your teacher for feedback. Ask your friends for feedback. Ask the best student in the year for feedback. Ask JeddAI for feedback, obviously. Come on here and submit your response and get some feedback from me. That's where you do that process. And you need to allow time. Think about it. If you've got 3 weeks, you need to prepare the draft early, time it, sit down and time it, and then work on cutting it down. And then you need to allow at least a week to get all this feedback from different people and be refining every night. This is when I would be doing things at the end of the night and doing your other subjects first. Any other subjects that are important or assessments that are coming up, prioritize them at this point, because now you're going to be spending hours just making small tweaks. The last thing, ideally up to a week before your assessment, and when you get to your final HSC, much sooner than this, but realistically in your tight assessment schedules during the term, ideally a week before, maybe it's 3 days before. For a lot of students, 2-3 days before, but ideally a week before, you are familiarizing yourself with the essay so that you feel comfortable writing it out without looking. Now that could look like, you memorize a lot of it. It could look like, hey, I know all my quotes. I know my introduction really well. I know all my key points. I know a lot of great sophisticated expressions and phrases that I've used. Perfect, because vocabulary will matter. Sophistication will matter. So the more you can learn as a base, the better. You're not going to repeat it on the day, but that is an important step 4 there. Okay, step 4 in terms of familiarizing. Some people would say memorizing, whatever you like, whatever you want to do there. I used to always learn all my essays off by heart because I felt more comfortable that way. But I would never rewrite all of them on the day. I would always change it to the question. And I practiced a lot of different questions to be able to do that. But I liked having the comfort. For me, it was just the comfort, right? Because I'm a control freak. I just enjoyed the comfort of having the base essay. Worst case scenario, at least I've got a really good polished essay, and I'll try and adapt it to the question. But worst case, it's a really solid essay anyway on the topic, and hopefully it's not going to go horribly. That's the worst case, but I would never obviously rely on that, and I would never regurgitate it, because step 5 is a couple of days at least before your school assessment. And ideally, give yourself a week to do this and be doing this while you're familiarizing and while you're learning your essay, is look at lots of practice questions, different types of essay questions. And what I would be doing is prioritizing rewriting your introductions and topic sentences. Now, why am I saying introductions and topic sentences and not just saying write full essays? Because that takes a lot of time. And I'm trying to tell you what the 80-20 is here. The 80-20, what's the 20% thing that's going to give me 80% of the benefit? Well, the 20% thing is write the most important 20% of your essay in terms of adapting to a question. And that's going to give you 80% of the results of how well you adapted. So markers are really looking closely at your introduction for how well you respond to the question, and the topic sentences. Of course, they're looking at the other parts as well. But if you can nail those ones in your practice, you're naturally going to do well on the other parts as well. So introductions and topic sentences for at least 3 different types of essay questions. Try and do more before each assessment. And you're just adapting and applying that draft essay that you've timed, refined, right? Timed, refined. Let's come up with the formula here. It's a draft essay that you've prepared early, timed and cut down, refined through lots of feedback and time that you spend reading it out loud and trying to perfect it, that you've familiarized yourself with or even memorized. And then now you've developed that skill through doing practice questions of adapting that draft, that core piece, to different questions, okay? And that... literally, if you follow all of those steps, I'm trying to think if I missed anything, that is the formula for success with a question. So that's the general formula that I would apply to Keats and Campion. Hopefully that answers it in a very general sense and it helps everyone. There's nothing unique about Keats and Campion. You just have to apply that formula. You have to go and look at practice questions for Keats and Campion, and the fact that it's an unseen question means if you're worried about it, practice lots of unseen questions and force yourself to write new introductions and adapt to the keywords of the question and learn that skill. And that's how you're going to be really good on the day. You'll be good on the day if you have a prepared draft in mind that you're familiar with, so you have lots of sophisticated material to use. And you'll be great on the day if you've practiced multiple unseen questions before and are used to the process of adapting, and then kind of combine those things together. So you don't just regurgitate the prepared piece, but you use that as a base to feel comfortable and to be quick on the day. If you've memorized something, you're going to be fast. You're going to be lightning fast, which means you get to write more, which means you get to cover more analysis, which on average will tend to lead to a higher mark. So there's the formula for you all. And Phoenix, just coming back to your comment, amazing feedback. Glad you resonate. Yeah, I have the exact same thing every day. Not procrastination, perfectionism, and procrastination. That's another one, right? That I'm sure someone will ask about soon. But the perfectionism thing is very stifling. So glad that helps, or hopefully that helps. Love your work, helped me a lot. I love when I started watching your videos. Thank you so much, Cool Joes, Cool Beans. Love the comment. Thank you for the feedback. No question in there, just flattering me. So thank you very much. Let me know if there's anything else that I can help with. I mean, always keen to get out more content that's useful. What did you find useful about the Crucible series? What was it that that was so helpful to you? And then, always looking to emulate that in other series and other videos that I do and that the team does. I've got a simple answer for you, my friend. You can find sample essays on Jeddle.com. In all seriousness, we have sample essays for the different texts there. You're just not going to find them on like Nessa. Like Nessa will publish like sample band 5, 6 responses. They're not amazing. So you do need to see the responses that students have actually got band 6s with. Standard English is incredibly hard to get a band 6 for. Okay. It's like 0.5% of the state. So it's like 1 in 200 students who do standard English, despite there being like 30,000 plus students who do it. 1 in every 200 will get a band 6. Okay. 1 out of 200. So if you're at a school that has 200 students doing standard English in the year, only one of you will get 90 or above. Okay, that's how crazy hard it is. So it's very hard to find those band 6 examples. We've tried to put them on Jeddle.com, so you can definitely find a couple on there for the different texts that you're doing. So check those out. But yeah, be aware that that's the standard, and that a lot of the examples that would come out from other sources are likely to be more of like a low band 5. But if you're getting, honestly, if you're getting a band 5, 80 or above in standard English, you're actually doing really well, because you're probably around the top 10% of the state. Helpful resources for Mod A. I mean, again, Jeddle is where we put all of our resources for all these modules. Our YouTube channel has lots of videos and resources there. More generally, helpful resources to help you stand out from other students. JSTOR, Google Scholar, looking at scholarly articles. That's what the very best students do. So you should be trying to do as many of those habits as you can. Employ them into your own routine. But best resources generally are just doing a search of academic articles, checking out Jeddle, watching the YouTube videos that are relevant to your Module A texts, and obviously using resources your teacher provides as well. And then when you've got essays and drafts and that, obviously we've got JeddAI. You can get expert feedback from our team if you want to do that. So it depends where you're at in the preparation process, but I would say they're kind of the core things. Hopefully your school provides pretty good resources. They should be the main source, really. So I hope that's helpful for you as well. All right, let's see. Anything else here? No worries. Guys, I'm going to answer 1 or 2 more questions. Geez, I had a student response to go through, but the participation has been good tonight, so I appreciate it. Appreciate you all getting active. I think, must have been like 2 episodes ago, maybe because it was like week 2 or 3 of the term, and it was dead. And I was just, on here by myself, just feeling sorry for myself. giving feedback to someone. So giving feedback to someone who wasn't even listening. So it's great to see all of the involvement here. I'm sure it'll keep ramping up as assessments get closer and closer and as the year progresses as well. But yeah, do keep leaving comments for anything else that you'd want help with, and any videos, anything that you want like a proper breakdown on. Give me some feedback on that if you can. Just searching through, I'm making sure I haven't missed anything. Oh, thanks, Rebecca. You didn't want to get that missed. I saw it above. Don't worry, I was coming to it. So, could you give an example of the imprisonment freedom structure? Yeah. So, what I mean by that is if you're doing 4 body paragraphs, so introduction, 4 bodies, and a conclusion, the structure would look something like this. I'm going to put it on the screen for you. Okay. So it's going to be. It's going to be. I'm thinking of the best way to present this on the screen for you. So give me a second. There are a lot of themes you can use. That's why it's important, as I said, to keep it simple and focus more on context and form and the differences, right? But I'll just show you the basic structure here. I'm just trying to make it as concise as possible so it's fully visible. And this structure gives you a lot of flexibility to, I'm just going to put prison instead of imprisonment, to explore different perspectives, different themes within it. So these aren't really themes, it's just a framework. Let's see if this works. There we go. So if you're doing a module A essay and you're doing something like Tempest Hagseed, or it could be anything. So for anyone watching, if you're doing 2 texts, this is just an example. So the first body paragraph, you would look at the first text, which is the Tempest, okay? And then you look at how the Tempest explores imprisonment. The second body paragraph would consider how Hagseed, the second text, the later text, the adapted text, because the Tempest is the source text, Hagseed is the adapted text. How does Hagseed explore imprisonment, and how is it different, and why is it different? How is it different, and why is it different? Why is it different? Because of those contextual dissonances, the difference between the 2 contexts. So you need to attribute those differences to specific contextual developments over time. Okay? Now we kind of split the essay in half. Bodies 3 and 4 are both on freedom. So, and again, this is just a way for you to push forward with your essay. This is just one way of doing this. But the third body paragraph could be, well, how does the Tempest explore freedom? We've looked at how it explores imprisonment. How do you get free from that prison? How does one free oneself or themselves from a state of imprisonment? How is that explored in the novel, right? And then Hagseed, how does Hagseed explore freedom, and how is it different, and why is it different? And it's different because of context. So now to kind of zoom in on that, I just wanted to give you the general structure first of all. I'm not sure if you already were clear on that, but that's just where I would start with it. Now you're probably thinking, well, what are examples? Like, where do I go? There are so many themes. Don't worry too much about themes. Let's just break down these terms specifically and let the analysis follow from that. So in the Tempest, what type of prison or what type of imprisonment do we see? Okay, what type of imprisonment? And why is someone imprisoned, right? So we see a kind of, it's a forcible exile that we see in the Tempest, okay? Like Prospero is forced to leave because he's neglectful of his duties as Duke, okay? So he effectively gets, betrayed, he gets exiled, he's on an island. Now he's physically, but also metaphorically imprisoned on the island, okay? So he's on this island, but it's a metaphorical prison, okay? So it's a figurative prison in the Tempest, okay? It's a figurative or metaphorical prison, and it's a prison, paradoxically, in which Prospero feels like he has a lot of control. So even though he's imprisoned on an island, he actually imprisons other characters on that island by exercising control over them because he uses his magical powers to exploit them. And he uses powers to, protect Miranda from the world. And he uses his powers to oppress Caliban. So there's lots of unique and interesting points on imprisonment there about the nature of it, that often paradoxically one can be imprisoned and yet feel like the person that's doing the imprisoning. Okay, so explore why that is. Explore why Prospero feels the need to exercise his magical powers to try and get control. Where does that come from? He's trying to entrap and imprison all of his enemies, everyone who betrayed him. They come across obviously with the Tempest. He conjures that up. They're trapped on the island, and he is imprisoning others as a mode of revenge. Okay, so revenge is a really key motivation for Prospero's imprisonment of others. So there's a concept. I'm just giving you some examples here. I'm going to rattle off some good stuff for you, hopefully. But yeah, just take notes of this or rewatch it. But you don't have to go with all of this, and you don't have to say all of this in one paragraph. These are just ideas. But yeah, so what's the motivation for Prospero's revenge? Or imprisonment of others, and it is revenge. Revenge was a key thing. Why was revenge a key thing? Because it was informed by medieval values, which were still prevalent during the Jacobean era. So that's how context comes into it, right? But then you can also explore the nuances of imprisonment and explore how Miranda, Prospero's daughter, is imprisoned by him, that he exercises patriarchal control over her and limits the extent of her knowledge of the world, okay? And then we can look at Caliban as being imprisoned and how that kind of symbolizes that master-slave dynamic that was relevant to the Age of Discovery. It was prevalent during the Age of Discovery, where there was mass colonization and colonizers were taking over these territories, right? Much like what happened in Australia, colonization. We had native Aboriginals living here, and then we came and more than oppressed them and took the land. And the Tempest is actually quite progressive in that sense, in that it suggests that Prospero, was almost wrong in doing it, because it shows that Caliban as one of the natives on the island actually has a deep spiritual appreciation for the island, and yet he's made out to be this evil character. Maybe he has done some evil things. Maybe that's true. Maybe he's barbaric at times. We don't know. But there's at least a tension there that Shakespeare's exploring. So that would be on the imprisonment side. Then you get to Hagseed. And if you're thinking about imprisonment in Hagseed, it's funny because the figurative sense of imprisonment that was occurring on the island, there wasn't actually a literal prison. The figurative prison is translated into a literal prison, because now we're in this more realist world. We're in a world that's meant to feel like real life. There's an actual prison that Felix is working in, right? And he's working in there with all of the collective Calibans, right? The collective embodiment of Caliban in the inmates. And he's trying to educate them. And he is there because he self-exiled. He wasn't forcibly exiled. He's self-exiled because now he's grieving over the loss of his daughter, Miranda, because in the reimagined version, Miranda has died. So now Felix is imprisoned, not so much by revenge. Not so much by revenge. Here's the nuance that you could include in the second body. Felix is imprisoned not so much by revenge, but rather by a sense of guilt. So what was inspired by medieval values is now inspired by more psychoanalytic values that taps into the psychological element of imprisonment. Now, the Tempest tapped into that on a metaphorical and subconscious level, but it had undertones there. But then that's made explicit, or at least a lot more obvious, in Hagseed, because now we're in the 21st century. People are more aware of how the psyche works and of this kind of psychoanalysis that was brought in by Freud. So we're in a different kind of paradigm, and we look at things a different way. We look at them through the psychological lens, more so than just through these external supernatural frameworks. So look, we're getting quite deep here and we're getting caught up in the detail. I might have lost you, I might be confusing some people. But my point is you can explore the differences in that way. And there's some really interesting analysis and comparisons that can be made in terms of the different forms of imprisonment. And then in terms of freedom, go and have a look at the end of the play. How does Prospero end up kind of being free? And how does that allude to Shakespeare's retirement? It was his last solo authored play. He's relinquishing control as a director because, back to the first point, Prospero was a metaphorical director. He's a director and he wants to control everything, and his magic represents Shakespeare's directorial control, because Shakespeare obviously was a director of plays. He wrote plays, and he's kind of embodied by Prospero. And Prospero, his magic represents the control that a director has on a stage. So there's another metaphorical layer for you to consider. Okay, so hopefully that helps. How would you go about picking what should go in each paragraph? That's kind of your discretion. I think I just pick things that aren't repetitive. I pick something that makes sense to me. So I would pick, one of those ideas that we've talked about in terms of imprisonment, something I know I can add three layers to, and like 3 layers is in 3 pieces of analysis. And then something that I know can be compared to Hagseed. So you just have to make those selections, mix up the characters a bit, but mainly mix up what you're saying about it. Like, if I just give you 3 examples, if I was talking about imprisonment in the Tempest paragraph, I could talk about Prospero's sense of imprisonment, how he feels imprisonment, find an example of that, or why he's trying to imprison the others, motivation of revenge. Okay, that might be the first thing. But Miranda is also imprisoned, and there's that taps into the patriarchal elements of the play and the patriarchal values of the time. And Caliban also feels imprisoned, but that's speaking to how Prospero, despite feeling like he's doing the right thing, actually is kind of playing into this colonizer paradigm where he's oppressing Caliban, and that's symptomatic of kind of the broader age of discovery that was going on. So you've got like kind of Prospero, Miranda, Caliban, 3 good things to focus on in terms of their experiences of imprisonment. You can talk about the fact that Prospero, in kind of orchestrating the sequence of events on the island, is a metaphorical play in and of itself, which is part of the meta theatricality of the play. There are so many elements here, so I'm wary not to confuse you, but hopefully just a few of those examples there helped inform what could go into a first body paragraph. Anonymous, just had my common mod exam today. How did it go? Hope it went well. When you guys finish your assessments, make sure not to just leave it. When you get your results, try and implement the feedback straight away so that you're in good stead for your trials, because a lot of people forget to come back to things like the common module essays, where a lot of you would have had related texts if you're doing the HSE. If you had related texts in your initial drafts, you need to make sure you don't leave it until the last minute to remove that and add in more of your prescribed text analysis, because there won't be any related text analysis in trials and the final HSE. So make sure once you get these assessments done, the drafts are in good shape, you implement the feedback straight away, and then you'll be ready to go. Just to clarify, Dank, for a thesis, we aren't supposed to mention the authors of the text. Oh, well, you can do it either way. So you've got 2 options. You can introduce the text and then present the thesis. It's more of a formality. Or you can just present the thesis and idea without the text and bring the text into the next sentence. You have 2 options. Sometimes I did one, sometimes I did another. Typically, where I could, I would try and just do the concept without the text. But if you get a question specific to a text, like, say, Hamlet, I'm thinking back to when I was doing it, and it was like Hamlet is one of the things, but say you're doing King Henry or T.S. Eliot or something like that for a critical study. If you get a really specific question, then it's okay to mention the text that the critical study is on in your very first sentence and in your thesis, because the whole study is on that person. So it'd be crazy to think you could be marked down for mentioning the text that the whole module is based on. So Mod B is a good one to consider introducing the author, or rather it's just a good one to not be afraid of introducing the author, so you can get straight into the text specific thesis that you should be presenting. You shouldn't be presenting a thesis that is not directly related to T.S. Eliot or whatever specific text it is for Module B. Thanks. I feel like for Mod A, it's better to introduce the authors. Yeah, exactly. You'll find through trial and error whether or not it works for you. What I think happens for Module A, if you're doing textual conversations, is students will try to not mention the text, but then their thesis statement ends up being really vague and just repeats the question, and it just sounds exactly like the module description. It doesn't really add much. So it could go either way. If you can't execute that top one that captures the value of a textual conversation, which, by the way, is what it should do if you're not going to mention the text. First sentence for Mod A could be, what is the value of a textual conversation? And you could be alluding to the value of your specific textual conversation that you're going to explore, but you could make it a little bit more general and then bring in the text after. So I've seen that work, and I'm actually I'm a fan of that for Mod A, coming up with a really good value statement for why is a textual conversation valuable? Like, what does that do? As long as you can provide specific insights that don't just repeat the rubric or module description, and it leads into the next sentence where you bring in the text and compare what the authors have done, then that can work really well. What tips do you have on adapting your essays? I mean, look, adapting essays it's a skill. Okay. So it's a mindset and a skill. Okay. You've got to frame it the right way, but you've also got to know the little tricks to do it. It honestly is going to be too hard for me to talk about it in the abstract. I'd rather take you through an example. And it's one of those videos high up on my priority list to sit down with, a sample paragraph, a new question, and show you guys how I would tweak things to suit a question. So that's something I'll put at the top of the list to create, a how-to video on. So look out for that one in the coming weeks. But generally speaking, the framework would be, you got to have the right mindset to know that, you're trying to make the question work for you. So you don't want to throw everything away that you've prepared for no reason. So you got to think very broadly about the question, but then beyond that, the idea is to basically reframe your ideas in terms of the key terms of the question. So you're saying the same thing, but in a different way, because there are a million ways to say the same thing, right? It's choice of words a lot of the time. Sometimes it's more than that, depends on how different the question is, but it is a different mindset to have. It's one that says, hey, I'm not just going to write something completely new, because the quality is probably not going to be as high if I'm doing it on the spot, unless you've done tons of practice and are a great writer and are super prepared for that. If you've got something prepared, it's like, hey, how do I communicate the exact same points in terms of the question? And then, sometimes I'm going to, where do I have to sacrifice some things that I wanted to say that just don't work with this? And where can I actually keep a lot of the things that I had that work quite well with this? So it's making choices of where you need to change things, how much you need to change things, and then, of course, how you change them. Like, what are the little tricks to do that? That's something I'll have to show you in a kind of video breakdown. Maybe that'll end up being the most popular video we make, but I'm gonna make a killer video on that, because I'm happy to share all the secrets as with everything on the channel. But that's something I've been meaning to do for some time. Now, what makes a good topic sentence? Missy, I've made a couple of great videos. I mean, I shouldn't say my own videos are great. You guys can tell me, but I put a lot of time into really going through the process of making a good topic sentence. So there's 2 videos that are on our channel recently. I put them out for free. They were going to go behind a paywall on Jeddle's website, but I'm like, no, let's just put them out there. I will go through step by step how to construct your topic sentences, and show you how to improve them to that next level, that band 6 level. What students do to basically get full marks with their topic sentences, the way they create a double layered topic sentence where there's basically 2 sentences. 2 recent videos, I literally go step by step through it, so I won't go through the whole thing here. And is it one that, but in terms of your question, is a good topic sentence one that addresses the theme, module, question, or all of these? I mean, it's like you kind of know the answer to this in the question. It's going to be a bit of all of that. Obviously, it's got to be something that responds to the question, but it's also got to introduce at least one specific insight. You have to teach us something. What did you learn from the text, or what's something insightful that you can share about the text that relates to the question and actually responds to the question. So it's a mix of responding to the question in a meaningful way by providing one specific insight, cause and effect, that is based on a key lesson or a key learning of yours from the text, or something that the author tries to teach us. So a very specific insight, often a cause and effect kind of idea, and partnering that with a direct response to the question. When you do that specific insight, that is your theme, and obviously using some of the module language where you can, peppering it in. The module aspect is less important than the question if you want to have a hierarchy there, but having a word or two where it works is definitely going to be beneficial, because it tells the marker, hey, this is a module specific response. So they are all important. Question first, specific question equal with having a specific insight, not just listing a couple of random theme words. Those two are basically number one. And then having, peppering in where you can the module terms, but don't list any of them and only put them in where they work. Okay, how does JeddAI work for students? What are the costs? Yeah, so if you go to Jeddle.com, and then click on the JeddAI tab, you can literally sign up there. You can try it for a month to start with, or you can, I think it starts from $9 per week on one of the plans. Otherwise, it's like $9 or $19. And you can try it for a month, or you can sign up for a year, and I think you save like 50%. Yeah, I think it's a 50% saving if you do it for the year. Even for the rest of the year, you'll still be better off. So jump onto that. How does it work? You basically can go on there, submit responses to a team of experts that we have. So it's like having on-demand, high-quality tutors there just for the purpose of reviewing your work and helping you perfect your drafts, whether it's an essay, imaginative piece, discursive, whatever it is. You want to mark, put it through. As long as you're a subscriber, you'll be able to do that. And then from the other thing you'll have access to is unlimited use of the teacher-trained AI that will use the most relevant rubrics for you. So not random GPT stuff where it's just going to give you these kind of irrelevant feedback and patches of text. You're going to get annotated feedback based on the rubrics that are going to be used to examine you. And you can put in your responses an infinite amount of times and get easy tweaks, practical suggestions of how you can improve the different sentences based on the rubric. So unlimited AI feedback. You can also submit as many times as you like to receive real life human feedback. Okay, so you got that magical combo. You're in pretty good shape if you're using JeddAI. Do you think memorizing an exemplar essay from a Band 6 student would be better than writing your essay? Do I think memorizing an exemplar from a Band 6 would be better than writing your essay? Interesting question. Well, no, I don't think it would be better. I mean, I don't know if we're talking about it from a moral point of view. Certainly that wouldn't be better, because you're just copying someone else's work, kind of defeats the purpose of the whole thing. Can seeing an exemplar from a Band 6 student be useful? Yes, because you can see in real life, you can actually see in front of you what worked to get a Band 6. But I would be drawing from that in terms of structure, the phrases, the ideas. Yeah, there might be a couple of things you want to borrow and work into your piece. But, besides the fact that it's just wrong, you can get caught out for plagiarism. It just defeats the whole point of everything. Besides all of that, I think it's better that you actually try and engage with the process. You'll get way more out of it. If you incorporate things from exemplars that you've seen, you use those ideas. That's what everyone does. People borrow, people mix and match, they experiment with it until they find their own voice. But I think definitely write your own, but draw inspiration from the Band 6s so you rise to the level of a Band 6 and put the time in to actually perfecting your own piece. But yes, you're constantly looking at them for reference, because that's the standard you are going to rise to if that is what you are looking at for inspiration, right? Makes sense. So you definitely write your own, draw upon examples. But the problem with just memorizing an exemplar is it also would it would work against you from a textual understanding basis, which will be disadvantageous or detrimental to adapting to the question on the day, which markers put a lot more weight on, right? Sometimes they throw harder questions these days. They expect to see a lot of adaptation. And if you don't have a thorough understanding of the text and you don't have that ownership of your response. You don't really know the essay that well. I mean, sure, you can get to know a random essay that you've learnt off by heart, but if you haven't like put in the time to construct it, not only will you not feel as satisfied, but you won't be as good a position, I would argue, to respond to different questions and to really be as flexible with the different possibilities that can come up. So, yeah, ethics aside, obviously it's the wrong thing to do, and I wouldn't recommend doing it. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't look at exemplars and try and draw inspiration from them. But I ultimately wrote my own stuff. But if you were to look at it and look at some of the exemplars, you'd be like, oh, that's like a similar idea there in that sentence. And oh, yeah, I remember seeing that there. And oh, he's tried to sound like that guy in that part, right? So there are little bits like that. But I really do think you want to kind of build your own and build the skill as well. Know how to build it from scratch. Like, don't you want to leave knowing how to do that? You're going to have to do it with other things. There are going to be lots of times where you need to construct a written piece. It might be an important email. It might be an important submission for uni. It might be something else, right? And it doesn't matter if AI is playing into all of this. If you don't know how to actually write and structure your thoughts, you're going to be pretty useless. That's kind of the broader point. And I know you're not. I know it's a great question, by the way. This is more just a general comment with that kind of AI and all of that coming out. That if you delegate everything out to AI and you think, oh, well, I'm not going to have to write any essays at uni because now they're letting you do AI, and I'm not going to have to do this, you're actually limiting your ability to think and really consider that. Like, you are stopping yourself from learning the ability to have ideas and structure it. And writing helps you think, thinking helps you write. You're not going to be able to come up with those kind of structured ideas in life, which is pretty crazy to think about. But yeah, that's like the deeper point of why you should try to get better at essay writing, is because it teaches you to think logically about concepts and teaches you to analyze things, if nothing else. So I think it's very important for your critical thinking and your ability to structure your ideas, because everyone's scattered these days, right? Everyone's on, these short form social media platforms. No one can think properly. No one can think for an extended amount of time. Make sure you're not falling into that trap for too long if you're already in it, and build up this skill. For Kenneth Slessor poems, how many poems should I memorize? Well, how many poems? Well, I assume you mean, well, I don't know what you mean, actually. Do you mean memorize the actual poems? I wouldn't memorize any of the poems. But do you mean memorize, how many poems should you use in your essay and then memorize those paragraphs? If so, 3 is always a good number, right? Because I like to have, for single text, Slessor is one text. Oh, like quotes. Okay. For single essay texts, then you're going to have 3 body paragraphs. So I would have 3 poems that you focus on, 3 poems that really encapsulate Slessor's poetry as a whole, because Slessor's poetry is one text, and those poems are kind of like chapters, if you like. So pick those wisely, and then for each one, I would aim to have 4. But that is subject to your ability to write all of that in 32 to 34 minutes, because you need to have time to adapt as well. So you need to actually time yourself writing it out before you commit to that and start learning it. And if you really want to do well, you'll actually follow that advice and time it out well in advance of your assessments. If you want to take a chance on it, then you might end up just regurgitating and you won't do as good a job at adapting, or you might finish with an incomplete essay. You won't have a conclusion because you run out of time. So 12 quotes is the ideal, 12 primary quotes. Remember to try and embed other little quotes in your analysis as well, not just the quotes that have the techniques that you're focused on. But 12 is the kind of guideline. But if you're a slower writer, maybe it's 9, maybe it's 10 quotes. Are there free trials for students with JeddAI? I'm trying to look now. There's no free trials on there because straight away you're getting, we're trying to tier it so we can have a free version. So I can't promise that that's going to be there, anytime soon. So you're probably worth just trialing it for a month at least, and just see how it goes. You can let us know if there's any issues. But at the moment, if you sign up to JeddAI, you're getting access to the unlimited access to the teacher trained AI tool, but also to a team of actual markers who are going to look at your work. So it's actually ridiculous value. I mean, it's crazy value that you can just have an expert look at your piece whenever you need it. We're going to create a tier that has a free version that's not going to have that. So if I was, and this tier is going to be more expensive. So if I was you, I would kind of try it out for a month. You don't have to commit for any longer. Otherwise, you get the 50% off. If you just want to commit for the year, it's 50% off if you do that. But yeah, this is basically the best deal you'll get to get access to the expert markers as well as the AI tools. So we might create that free trial version tier, but I'm not sure exactly when it's going to be out. So I wouldn't rely on that coming out super soon, but we're working quickly. Hypothetically, if you make up quotes from Shakespeare, do you think markers will notice? Well, I don't think you should risk it either way, is my answer, because if they do notice, it will work against you. And especially for something like Shakespeare, I mean, if it was a related text that no one knew about, sure, you might get away with it because they're not going to have time to verify everything. But that, again, is beside the point. You shouldn't do that. You might as well learn the quote. But I guess the assumption in your question is if you have forgotten a quote or you can't remember exactly how the quote went because you're in the pressure of an on-the-spot exam and you have nothing to look at, first of all, you didn't prepare enough. You've got to make sure the quotes are the first things that you actually memorize when you go through it. You need to know them super, super well. But if you did happen to forget, if you get a couple of words wrong here or there, you'll probably get away with it. But it's a backup method. Don't rely on that happening. If you just made up a random quote in full, I would ask kind of why did you do that when could have just used a real quote? I don't know what the advantage of that would be. I guess it's if you did no preparation and you rock up to the exam and now you're having to make up things. Yeah, I think if you're in that mindset of not having put in any work, then it's going to be pretty obvious because it's very hard to write like Shakespeare. So I would almost be impressed if you could do a made up quote from Shakespeare with how Shakespeare writes, right? That would be impressive. I'd probably give you a bonus point for that. But yeah, there's a difference between getting a few words wrong or filling in a few words that you forget. That's okay. I mean, not ideal, but okay. But if you're thinking, oh, I'm going to go in and just make up some things, again, you're not going to write like Shakespeare. So it's going to be quite obvious. So they're kind of your options. Do we need a related text? You only need a related text for English Advanced, well, at least for the current cohort, for year 12 up to next year. And then you won't even technically need to do a related text, but schools can still choose to do them from 2027 in year 12. But up to next year, yes, there's a related text for your internal assessment, but there is no related text in your trials or final HSC. So you need to get rid of the related text if your school assessed you on one for your internal assessment. What are the best ways to link John Keats' poems conceptually? Well, that's a bigger question. I might have to put that one on pause. I've also got to finish up in a second. And because that one's very text specific, I might not get into it right now. But I mean, I feel bad not giving you something. What are the best ways to link John Keats' poem conceptually? He basically has those, he has the Holy Sonnets. He has kind of the poems that are based more around love. So if you actually think about the division of the poems for Keats, I would think about it in terms of uncertainty about death and fear of death, fear of mortality, right? And then you can find a few poems that fall into that category about his fear of death. And then there are some other poems that are more about human connection. And it relates to death in the sense that sometimes he's trying to escape the thought about death because he's so scared. So you can establish the directly confrontational poems with death, where he's considering the afterlife and whether there is an afterlife and what happens after you die. Any of those concerns around mortality, I would think about that as kind of one set. And then you can think about the other side of things where it's more on the human connection side. There are a couple of poems about that or love. So think about that as a coping mechanism for those fears, or a way that he's able to kind of steer his attention away from that existential uncertainty or ontological uncertainty. So that's how I think, generally speaking, about it. But again, that's off the cuff. It might not be precisely correct, but that's generally how I would think about it. If you submitted a paragraph in your Google form, I do look over them in the streams, but this one's gone for an hour and 45. This is crazy. But I've enjoyed it. There's been a lot of good commentary and good input from you guys. So it's actually flown. I'm not going to look at any today, but I'm doing these every week. That's my challenge to myself. Just weekly, every Tuesday, relentless feedback, free advice, help you as much as I can. I will go through the submissions, but yes, you do need to go in the queue, and I get to them as soon as I can in these. Sometimes there's just a lot of questions about assessments and whatnot, and I try and prioritize that for everyone who's on the stream. But for the most part, I get through one or two responses. There's not too many in the queue at the moment, so submit it using the link in the description of the YouTube video. Do it as soon as you can. Maximum a paragraph. If it's too long, if it's a whole essay, I'm not going to look at it because it's not fair to everyone else. So include a question and one paragraph of what you want looked at. Could be a creative, could be an essay, and I'll look at it as soon as you're up in the queue. Thank you for joining more of these. Let's keep it going all year. If you need quick questions answered, you need a little bit of extra help, then just jump on, and happy to assist that way. Any makeup, my English teachers love you. I appreciate that. Means a lot. Yeah, I won't ask for your school, but I'm glad to hear that. Okay. What's the best way to introduce text? Love the double up. Didn't want to miss it. I love it. Jamming these questions in, keeping me up. I got to get home, guys. What's the best way to introduce text? Again, general question. Hard to deal with general questions. I have to kind of assume a few things here. When you first introduce a text, there's formalities that need to come with that. And then there's obviously the more kind of the insights that come with it, right? The deeper insights. So what are the formalities when you introduce a text? Full name of the text, full name of the author, include the date of publication, put it in brackets. And if you're going to later shorten the title for the rest of your essay, then include in brackets a shortened version of the name that you're going to use throughout. That's the formalities, okay? So you introduce everything in full names, full words, full proper spelling, date, author's name, etc. Then in terms of the insights, you actually want to do three things in terms of introducing your texts. When you introduce a text, not only do you introduce those formalities, but you introduce the core concept, right? The core idea, one specific idea that relates to the question. So try and incorporate the words of the question in your overall thesis for the text that you are introducing, but provide a high level, but insightful point or argument about that text, okay? And then what you want to do is you want to link that to the overall, or rather one of the most prevailing contextual influences of the time. So you want the contextual influence, the core insight or core argument in terms of the idea that is represented in that text. You want the form. So make sure you refer to the fact that it's facilitated by the dramatic form, okay? And talk about why it's important that it's a play. So just a vague mention, doesn't need to be too precise, but some kind of mention of the form of the text is really important as well. That almost can go under the formalities part as well. So, name, author, date, and form. So in the play, or you can even say the genre as well, like in the tragic play, whatever, right? In Arthur Miller's tragic play, The Crucible. And then in terms of the other parts, you want to make sure you've covered a concept, just one specific insight, the context, one key contextual influence, at least in the introduction, and the key aspect of form that kind of aids the representation of that idea, which was inspired by that contextual influence. And the final thing, you don't have to do all of this necessarily in one sentence, but it actually is pretty easy to do if you do context at the front of the sentence, then introduce the form along with the formalities, then bring up the concept, is just a little bit of the plot. So we know what happens generally in that text in relation to that idea. And I don't mean to like story tell, but just a reference to the fact that, you know, if you were doing 1984, where everyone knows Big Brother, whether you're studying or not, if you would mention Big Brother as Big Brother, or Winston attempts to resist the oppressive force or the totalitarian control of Big Brother. Like references to a couple of key characters and like what the tension is, just to ground us in the text from the outset, is the other important part. So it's kind of formalities, including form, the key concept, a link to the overall context, and something connected to the plot or the key character so that your idea is grounded within the text. And that might happen over one or two sentences. All right, appreciate it. Maybe it. Thank you very much. Oh, that's good. That's good. You should. So, hey, shoot me an email. I might be able to help with that. I'll give you my email here. Do push for JeddAI because it is super helpful. A lot of schools are loving it at the moment. Shoot me an email here. Tell me what school you're at, and we'll try and help out there and get you a subscription to JeddAI and the content. Okay, and that goes for anyone else, you know. Definitely happy to work with schools. We work with a lot of schools at the moment, so if we can help out, let me know. Zane, great to see you. You know, it's late in the game. We're at the end of quarter four. I'd say I'm stumbling on my words. I'd say we're almost at overtime here. In terms of unseen texts or an unseen question, you finished your entire essay. Any tips to be more efficient? You couldn't finish it. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to reserve that. You're going to have to hold that question. Ask me in the next one. So next Tuesday, 7:30. These start. More or less, give or take 10 minutes. But be here around 7:30 next week. And Zane, if I see your name on here, just remind me, like, hey, I had a question from last week. I'll go through that in detail. But in all sincerity, my brain is starting to fry, and I'm trying to wake up early these days, guys. And it's hard when you're doing these till like close to 10. If our Mod A text has multiple poems, around 7, how should we structure our essay to include these poems? Don't use all the 7 poems, of course. You just focus on, yes, a few poems. You have a few primary poems. So if your whole essay is just on the one set of poetry and it's not a comparative, so if it's just on one text or one collection, then I would focus on 3. Like if it was T.S. Eliot, I would have one poem per paragraph. And then I would know the core points, the core kind of themes, or one core theme for each of the other poems. So you still have to do some preparation on the other ones in case they get asked about or in case they happen to be more relevant. But generally speaking, that won't happen. It's really just in case that you get asked specifically about one poem. So 3 I would have as your primary reference. Possibly 2 if it's a comparative study. You have 2 main ones that you're looking at, and then you might have 2 other secondary references where you only mention another poem once or twice, but mainly stick with 2 if you're comparing it with a whole nother text. And then know a little bit about the other poems that you don't plan on using in an ideal scenario. So the topic, have a kind of a topic sentence concept for each of the other poems that you don't intend on using, just as a backup. And then no 2 or 3 quotes, just 2 or 3 quotes for each of those other ones. Grimshaw, using mishap on my teacher. She prefers we use mainly symbolism, but I feel it's repetitive. Got any common niche literary techniques we could possibly use? Well, I'm glad you use mishap. Mishap is, they are pretty basic techniques, but it's more just a quick way to remember some of the core ones, like metaphors, imagery, simile, hyperbole, alliteration, personification. A lot of figurative devices covered there. So that's just one of many acronyms. Of course, you've also got MEST, which is more about modality, emotive language, syntax, tone. And there are other ones. There's lots of types of repetition. So, eat an apple every day. if you actually break that down, I know this is on the analysis modules on Jeddle.com, where I break down all the different types of repetition, like anaphora and other ones, and I go through examples. So niche literary techniques for repetition are good. So eat an apple every day. And there's actually an advanced version of that, which is eat an extra apple every day. So these are techniques like epistrophe, epinalepsis, anadiplosis, anaphora. You can look these things up. But eat an apple every day, D being diacope or diacope, that'll give you 5 specific types of repetition that will help you stand out and avoid just saying repetition. And there's lots of other niche techniques that I've got, especially if you're thinking about, poetry or prose. We've got several other ones, that can be useful. I mean, if you want a few to go off, we do have the leaves acronym as well, which is like lexical choice, which is like the specific choice of language. For poems specifically, enjambment. Then there's A, which I think in that case we've used anaphora again. You've also got V for volta, when there's a tonal shift in a poem. V for volta, when the tone suddenly shifts. Often it's between 2 stanzas. Maybe it's in the second stanza, the shorter stanza of a sonnet. There's a sudden shift in tone. And what else have we got? Another E. I think that's just another one of those repetitions. So like epistrophe or epiphora is the same thing as epistrophe, where there's repetition at the end of 2 sequential sentences or clauses. Anaphora is when there's repetition at the beginning of 2 consecutive clauses or sentences. And S, symbolism, always a good one. Symbolism is always a good one. So I mean, symbolism is great. Like mishap, the first word is metaphor. Extended metaphor. An extended mishap. What about a mishap that happens for a long time? We hope not, but extended metaphor could be the way you remember that. Oh, an extended mishap. So extended metaphors are awesome techniques to try and use in your own writing as well when you're doing, discursive writing especially, or imaginative. Always a good way to stand out. Use an extended metaphor throughout. It's always impressive if you can pull it off. I think I just rattled off like a bunch of techniques between mishap, messed, leaves, eat an apple every day. That's already like over 20 techniques. So look, you don't need to go too crazy on them. It's just about being quick on the day to spot them with a reading task. And then there's a bunch of other techniques that obviously come up with other texts that you'll analyze and study. And, if you do your research, look at the Jeddle resources, there's tons of techniques throughout there. Those ones are more just for quick fire technique identification, so that you can pick up on things straight away and quickly in a reading task where you're looking at all these unseen texts and questions. Obi-Wan, great to see you. I love how everyone's just like joining after 2 hours. Like what's going on here? I guess stay on the live stream long enough and people will come. Good crowd tonight though, so appreciate you all joining. For Mode, Mrs. Dalloway in the hours, assessment task needs us to write 3 separate essays. That's brutal, but your assessment task needs you to write 3 separate essays. Is that because you have 3 possible questions that you've been given and you're going to be asked one of them? Keto. So yeah, do let me know if that's the case, because you're saying it like you need to do that, but my guess would be you've been given 3 possible questions and you're going to get one, so you need to be prepared for all 3, which actually doesn't require you to write 3 completely different essays if that's the case. So just clarify that. I haven't seen an assessment where someone actually needs to submit 3 whole essays. That's a crazy amount of work. But yeah, my guess would be you've got 3 possible options and you're going to be asked 1. Is that right? If keto's still on. It's an important point. Could save you a lot of time here if you happen to respond. Otherwise, I'm going to jump off in a minute. Oh, no, you responded. Nice. Guess I'm staying. Yes, I don't know what to do. The body paragraphs about, though, they're mostly about textual conversations. Do I separate the paras by themes? So you're saying, yes, that's right. I assume you have been given 3 possible essay questions, which is different to how that sounds, because it was almost sounding like you have to write 3. Not that I believe that, but I've seen assessments like this before where you get the options. They do that because they want to kind of help you out. Like, hey, we're not going to give you the exact question. We're going to give you 3 possible questions. And, they're trying to discourage you from memorizing something because they're saying, well, you're going to have to memorize 3 full essays if you want to cover all possibilities here, which is a lot, right? That's why they've done 3. 2, you could almost push for it and justify doing that. But yeah, memorizing 3 for the 1 assessment, it's a lot of work in the context of a term 1 assessment. So let's go to your follow-up here. I don't know what to do. The body paragraphs about, they're mostly about textual conversations. Well, everything's about textual conversations. The whole module is called textual conversations, right? So that's not even the thing. Like, the whole thing is textual conversations. So make sure you're understanding that like you're framing it correctly. The whole module is a textual conversation. That's not something that a body paragraph could be about specifically. Of course, the body paragraphs are speaking to the broader textual conversation, but the focus can't just be that in and of itself. There has to be a type of textual conversation that you're exploring in relation to a concept. So the idea, for instance, yes, you do separate the paragraphs by themes. And the idea of confinement and liberation is a big one. It's very similar to the Tempest Hagseed, imprisonment, freedom, basically just 2 synonyms here. But confinement, Mrs. Dalloway, characters feeling trapped, feeling limited by societal expectations, trying to express themselves, but feeling like they can't because of the time, the context in which they exist, and the implications that has psychologically on the characters. That's something to explore. And then how does the hours kind of progress that story? How does she allow for more evolution of the characters, right? How does doing it that way in a modern context actually transform or advance the conversation with respect to confinement and liberation? How is there liberation? Maybe it's a darker form of liberation in Mrs. Dalloway, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's a more positive angle that you look at from that text. And then when you get to the hours, you need to think about that shift in form, the fact that it's like a cinematic form. It's got those different character plot lines, right? You've got those different plots going on, and they represent different parts of the story of Mrs. Dalloway and the author and the reader, and who Mrs. Dalloway wanted to be. So the idea that the textual conversation in itself is a pathway to liberation of the characters is an interesting one, and it actually is a way of kind of rejuvenating them, right? Giving them more life in a contemporary context. So what I would do, I think the nuance is the textual conversation that's created by the hours, by Stephen Daldry, in itself is a pathway to liberation. And if you can make that kind of nuanced point in the second half of your essay, when you're talking about the hours in relation to liberation, then I think that will put you in a good position to do quite well. Obviously, you need to talk about specifically how they explore confinement and liberation differently, but think about how the textual conversation itself plays into the confinement, but also, and more so, plays into the liberation element. Hope that makes sense, but I would split it up into those 2 halves and then talk about each text in relation to confinement, talk about each text in relation to liberation, but be talking about the conversation itself as part of the confinement and or liberation. All right, lots of questions coming in. Rimsha, are you from Victoria or are you from New South Wales? How different is the writing component compared to VCE in Victoria? Well, the VCE in Victoria has the framework of ideas where, and that's a unit called creating texts, and it's basically a rip-off or a copy of the craft of writing from New South Wales. So they're very similar. There's like a reflective component, an explanation that students have to do. They just are a bit looser in terms of form when it comes to imaginative, discursive, persuasive. They wouldn't put it like that. They wouldn't have those 3 distinct categories. They would allow for a more kind of free-flowing piece that has elements of all of those. And you can be a lot more creative and fluid there. So they don't have those categories strictly defined, but that writing component, if that's what you mean, the craft of writing versus creating text, very similar in nature. where you study a mentor text. They call it a mentor text. You have a prescribed text and you draw inspiration from it. You reflect on the process of your own writing. What am I still doing here? Let's keep going. If I want to make an integrated essay structure for my comparative, is it best to include 3 body paragraphs with 3 main quotes? If I want to have an integrated 3 bodies, 4 quotes, ideally, 2 examples from each one, okay? So if you're integrating, that means each body paragraph is going to mention both texts. If you only do 3 quotes, what that means, you're going to do 2 from one text and look at the balloons, 2 from another, or 1 from another. It would be uneven. You definitely want to have a balanced analysis between the 2 texts. So go for 4 and see how you could do for time doing that. But I think because you're doing the integrated structure, you do gain a bit of time because that's 1 less topic sentence and link sentence, even if you're still doing 12 pieces of analysis in total. So it'd be 2 and 2. You can do 2 sentences of analysis back to back on one text and then 2 back to back on another, or you can alternate within the paragraph. Do what works best. The alternating within the paragraph is quite hard to pull off and probably not worth it in most cases, but see how you go. I would probably just do 2 bits of analysis on the first text, straight into 2 on the next that are comparing. All right. That's it, guys. I'm just having a look if I missed anything. Famous last words. Also, when I'm analyzing a quote, I'll move on to the next one. Yeah, last thing I'm going to answer. This is definitely the last question. Also, when I'm analyzing a quote and want to move on to the next one, I find it challenging to link the messages of the first quote to the second quote. Great questions coming out here. I'm going to look back at this and make some separate content on some of these things. Just to go into them in more depth. But simple answer, if you're struggling getting a linkage, that's because you're thinking too much about the quotes. You're saying, oh, I'm going to pick this quote than this quote. That's not how you should be thinking about it. When you plan out your body paragraph, the first consideration is, what's the specific idea I'm going to talk about first? And then I'm going to find a quote or example to back that up. Then after that first idea, what's the second idea that stems from that or that follows on? So you make your first sub idea, which is going to be backed up by an example or quote. And then you say, well, as a consequence of that point, this point can be made. Like, you make a point that when people are isolated, when people are by themselves, they lose power. Okay. So that's your first point. And then you have a quote to back that up. But see how I'm leading with the point, the idea, I'm not leading with the quote. So you lead with the point. And then the next point is, well, because you lose power, you lose the ability to think critically, or you lose the ability to be an individual. Like you lose power, you lose influence, and now you can't be yourself or something. I'm making this up. But you get to that next point, and then you get a relevant example there. Okay, so it's a funny process here, but you're kind of analyzing the text and looking at all of the quotes first to inspire the ideas. Then you put the ideas in before you put the quotes, but you know that you'll be able to find quotes for the ideas because you considered the text and the quotes before you put the ideas in, right? So it's a bit of like cat and mouse there. Effectively, you need to think, what 3 points do I want to make in this body paragraph? Make sure they all flow on from one to the next, and then find examples that work with them. Then it's not about, how do I link the first quote with the second quote? It's saying, I already thought about how the points link. I'm just putting on the quotes. So I've already got the connections there. So change the order, change the way you're thinking about that. And I think that will help quite a bit with it. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night. I'm going to jump off. Thank you for joining, and see you next week, 7:30. Use the link below the descriptions. Check out JeddAI if you haven't already on Jeddle.com, and you can also sign up to Jeddle to get access to all of the analysis, study guides, everything you need to prepare for your exams. Otherwise, see you soon.